What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over cost reduction glyphs versus magicka regen glyphs, specifically why everybody is recommending that you use magicka regen glyphs versus cost reduction glyphs. So this kind of popped up on Reddit a few days ago. Someone was asking how come all the quote-unquote popular YouTubers are recommending magicka regen glyphs and not cost reduction glyphs, because based on their math, the magicka regen glyph is 169. Let me just pull it up real quick on in my inventory. Here. So the magicka regen glyph is 169 magicka regen, and the cost reduction glyph reduces magicka cost by 203. Now their reasoning is because magicka regen here recovers every 2 seconds. When you add magicka regen, you're only getting 169 regen per second. However, the global cooldown for abilities is 1 second, so you're actually able to do 2 abilities within 2 seconds. So the cost reduction results in a effective regen or cost reduction of 406 per 2 seconds. So clearly, to this user, it seemed like the cost reduction glyph seemed a lot better than the regen glyph, because you're saving more magicka than you are regenerating versus these when you compare these two glyphs. However, they were not accounting for a lot of different things that I'm going to discuss in this video. So the first thing is cost reduction is a flat amount of decrease. There are really no sort of buffs, no sort of passives, nothing that reduces magicka cost for abilities. The only ability that reduces magicka cost is actually magicka mastery under the Breton skill line. When you have it completely maxed out, just do this real quick, you can see it reduces our magicka cost of our abilities by 3%. This is the only other source of cost reduction, at least as a ratio. That can be used across all classes. Now, Templars do have a passive that reduces the cost of their magicka abilities by 4%, so that is unique to Templars. So if you have a Templar Breton, then you get both of those cost reductions added in. But those are the only two sources of ability cost reduction that you will find in the game. But now you want to compare that to magicka regen. Now, regen has a lot of different buffs. Some of them are named, other of them are not. So obviously you have major intellect and minor intellect. Let me see here, potions. So you can see here major intellect increases our magicka regen by 20%. And if we go over here to Empowered Ward gives us minor intellect, which increases our magicka regen by 10%. Now there are other sources of magicka regen as well. Obviously we have our CP passive up here under the lever. We have Arcanus, which increases it up to 15% depending on how many CP points you put in. You also have, under the Mage's Guild passive, you have Magicka Controller, which increases regen by 2% for every Mage's Guild ability you have slotted, so that's going to vary based on class. Obviously, if you are a vampire, you get additional regen. As long as you are stage 2, you get up to 10% additional regen if you are a stage 2 vampire. And depending on, let me see, where is it? Depending on your class, you also have additional regen from your class as well. It might be under Storm Calling. Yeah, so see here, Sorks have Capacitor, which increases magicka regen by 10%. I know Templars have a passive that increases... No, Templars don't have it. Nightblades have a passive that increases magicka regen by up to 15%. Wardens, I believe, also have a 12% extra regen as long as they have an Animal Companion ability slotted in their skill bars, which most magicka wardens will have. So all of those passives do affect the magicka regen glyph. So right now we have 2 spell damage glyphs and a magicka regen glyph. So if the Reddit poster is correct, when I add this in, I should only see a 169 increase in our regen. So right now I'm sitting at 1051. So if we do 1051 plus 169, I should see 1220 as my base regen, when I add this in. However, you can see here when I hover over it, it actually says my Magicka regen will go up to 1295, and that is due to those passives that I was talking about. The CP passives, you have the Sork passives, you have the Vampire passives, all of those add up together, so you actually get more than the 169 advertised Magicka regen on the regen glyph. So I'm just going to swap over now over to ESO build user tool. Let me see here. So if you guys haven't used this yet, I highly recommend you do this. It details a lot of how different stats are calculated. It lets you pick your sets, and it'll tell you what your effective spell power is, all your regen and your stats and things like that. So if you haven't been using this tool already to make your builds into Theorycraft, I highly recommend doing so. So what we're interested here is Magicka recovery. So we can see here, this is the very convoluted looking formula for Magicka regen. So we can see here that this is the base amount of regen that you get. This is from your items, so that's basically any sort of set effect that you might have, 2, 3, 4, 5-piece set effects. This is set Magicka regen. If you have a complete set, a 5-piece set that increases your Magicka regen, something like, I believe Shackle Breaker would fit under set Magicka regen. You have Mundus Magicka regen. This is if you choose, I don't remember what the Magicka regen, Atronak. If you have the Atronak Mundus, that's where this comes in. So all these are additive. So if you have, for example, 129 and you have 250 and you have, let's say, 300, those are all added onto your base amount of Magicka regen. So now this is where things start to get a little bit, it looks complicated, but here's how it all works. So food Magicka regen, that obviously comes from your food buffs. Now this is multiplied by 1 over 1 plus skill 2 dot Magicka regen, so that's just any sort of skill, really. CP times 1 plus the CP Magicka regen, skill Magicka regen plus buff Magicka regen times 1 plus skill 2 dot Magicka regen. So I'm not 100% sure what skill 2 is. I haven't really played around with this too much. However, we do know what buff, skill, and CP all count for. So skill is basically any sort of passive skill, so the Vampirism passive, your Sork passive, your Magicka Controller, and the Major Skill passives. Your buff Magicka regen comes from Major and Minor Intellect, and your CP Magicka regen obviously comes from your CP. So what this convoluted looking thing is saying is you basically are adding in all of your Magicka regen. So remember, order of operations, you want to multiply things and do things within parentheses first, and then multiplication, and then addition and subtraction. So we'd be calculating everything under the parentheses first. So here we see 1 plus CP plus skill plus buff. So if we add all these together, we see here this all adds up to 58% additional regen plus the 1. So obviously the 1 accounts for just making it so it is 1 point whatever, so that way it actually boosts it by the advertised amount. So the 1 is basically just there to make the formula work. Obviously we don't have anything under skill 2 here, so we can just cancel these out, just ignore them. So this becomes 0, or this becomes 1 I should say, and then this bottom half becomes 1, so this entire factor here becomes 1. So now we have your base regen here, plus your item, plus your set, plus your Mundus, and then you have your food Magicka regen, and that entire food Magicka regen is multiplied by this whole thing here. So we have 1.58% additional regen. Now if we add in something like, let's see, items. So if we add in the regen glyph, we can see here that it boosted up greater than the 169 that is advertised here. So we go from 1316. So if we just added in straight 169, we would expect to see what? We'd see 1480 something and change. But instead we see 1583, and that is because of this additional multiplicative factor here. So that's basically what's happening here, and that's why regen is much more powerful than cost reduction, because you have all these buffs that increases the base amount that your regen glyph is actually adding. So you can just basically If you just take this and multiply it by 1 plus whatever your buffs and your skills and your CP is, you get the actual base that you would add on to your regen. So in this case, you'd be adding on just over 270-ish regen. So that's a flat increase every 2 seconds. The other thing you also want to consider is that cost reduction only affects your, well, the cost of your abilities. If you're not using abilities, then it doesn't affect your regen at all. So for a lot of boss fights, you aren't going to be casting abilities every 1 second. There's going to be instances where the boss becomes invulnerable and you can't attack it, or you have to play mechanics and you won't be attacking the boss because you're playing those mechanics. There are going to be cases when you die and you need to get rezzed, and the default res timer is 7 seconds if you get rezzed right away. So whenever you have downtime, cost reduction is not doing anything for you versus the regen glyph, which is always active no matter what. You're out of combat. Obviously, it doesn't happen when you're dead, but obviously it helps you regen your resources faster when you do get revived. When you aren't able to attack the boss because you have to play the mechanics, then your regen is working for you there. So that's kind of why the regen glyph itself is a lot stronger compared to the cost reduction glyph. The first is obviously it gets buffed by all these passives, class passives, CP passives, things like that. And the second is because it is active all the time versus cost reduction, which is only active when you are casting your abilities. So ultimately, yes, if you are casting abilities every 1 second, no matter what, you're not dying, you don't have to play mechanics because you're just that good, and you're able to cast your abilities every 1 second, then yes, cost reduction does end up mathematically beating out regen glyphs, even with all these passives. However, once you take into account all those breaks in your ability casting, things like latency, lag, you know, mechanics, things like that, all of a sudden the regen glyphs becomes a lot more powerful, and it actually ends up beating out the cost reduction glyph by a not a very large margin, but definitely enough to be noticeable. So that's why all of these popular YouTubes, myself included, we will recommend you, if you do want to swap out one of your spell damage glyphs on your jewelry, to swap it to a regen glyph and not a cost reduction glyph. Just because that regen glyph is just a lot more beneficial basically in every single way. There's really no reason to use cost reduction unless you are that perfect player that is able to cast your abilities every single second. Which, let's be honest, 99.99% of players in the ESO player base aren't going to be able to do that. So that's why all of us are recommending regen over cost reduction. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. I will see you guys in the next dungeon.